We'll make a new tomorrow. Talk to me. What makes this happy feel good? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy feel good?
All right, good evening. Ready for um another episode of Star Wars reading. I don't know what I was trying to say there. I don't know where I was going. But yeah, anyway, we are finishing up the next in the Lost Tribe of the Sith Savior, which actually I have it labeled as third, but I don't think it's the third. I think it's actually the fourth. So I mislabeled that. My apologies. So, yeah, I think this is the last one. And then we get into um we get back into some of the comics, the Ulrich Kaldroma um miniseries, followed by the Naomi Sunrider miniseries. So yeah, tonight will be the last book for a while. Then we get back into comics. So, all right, real quick. Sorry. There we go. Oh, let's jump into it and finish up this book. We are on chapter 3. All right. It wasn't the rush of bodies that startled Corson so much as where they came from. Black-clad Sith descended upon the plaza from the living quarters, doorways, upper windows, rooftops, and from the ramparts of Omen's multi-level temple. Corson ignited his lightsaber and stood his ground as the invaders approached. They were Jared's sabers, the same team from the previous morning. Corson exchanged glances with Gloyd. Their bodyguards flanked them, forming a defensive huddle facing outward, 4-1. Stick together. Corson watched as Jared strode purposefully from the temple doorway, weapon lit. This doesn't look like the northern reaches to me, Jared. His nephew said nothing. He had that wild look again, Devore's look. I agreed to your little group to give you something to do, Corson yelled. He addressed Jared's stern companions. You should be ashamed. Get back to Tav. I'm not like Nita, Jared said, still approaching. I don't need hobbies. Enough time has been wasted. He walked around his Confederates, now forming a perimeter of glowing lightsabers around Corson's group. It's time to make your reckoning, Commander. I'm sorry, Commander Corson. You told us yourself a new age has dawned. It's time for military authority to end. This is about succession, about who should best lead the tribe. Who? You? Corson tried to act surprised, and chuckled. Oh, Jared, I really don't think so. Go home. Jared froze, evidently aware of the watchful stares from his own forces. Gloyd, seeming to catch the idea, guffawed. Commander, I wouldn't put this one in charge of mucking out the Uvak stalls. I'm the future, Jared boomed. I'm the youngest of those born on high. All Sith after me are Kesh-born. He raised his lightsaber. The leader of the Sith should be special. Corson glared and growled. You're not special. I've seen your like before. A woman's voice rang out. Tell him about it. Sela. He'd forgotten about her. She stood at the end of the plaza, now joined by several of her loyal retainers, all armed. Tell him about how you saw his father die, Yaru. Tell him how you killed him and threw his body onto the rocks, all to keep control of us. Corson started to respond, only to see Jared step backward. The sabers closed in. Clearly, Jared was going to let them take the first blows before entering for the kill. Corson steeled himself and looked to the clouds. Noon. Suddenly, shadowy figures sailed across the quad. 5, 10, dozens of creatures took to the skies, lifting from behind the temple. Uvak. Theirs. What in blazes? Jared looked to his mother. Sela appeared to have no more idea than he did. An answer finally came from one of her aides, rushing breathlessly up the staircase to the plaza. The stable hands, the Kashiri, they're stealing our Uvak. Several of Jared's sabers looked up, stunned. Corson saw his chance. He and Gloyd launched toward the black suits on their side, sweeping a deadly path toward the nearest building. Their bodyguards closed in behind them, blocking pursuit as best they could. Corson and Gloyd dashed through the building, followed by a mob of sabers. Corson made for the staircase, beckoning for Gloyd to follow. Nice trick, Commander, Gloyd said, but we could have used more than that. It's not my trick, Corson said, reaching a window. And you're right. He looked urgently toward the skies and probed the force in vain. He had been delivered from the mountain years before, but he could sense that his delivery now was far away. Her riding had improved since her first desperate flight years before. Now Adari ably guided Nink as he soared, following the jagged coastline below. Behind her flew more than 100 Uvak, the entire population of the stables at the mountain temple, ridden by Kashiri stable hands, domestics, and laborers, all agents of Adari's movement, all carefully positioned there for this day. If any mounts had been left to the Sith in the temple, no one was using them to follow. The flock approaching far from the east was one of hers. There'd be others. In villages across the continent, the same thing would be happening. Neshtavar conspirators, merely tending their Uvak, would instead take to the air with them, leaving none behind. There wouldn't be riders enough, but that didn't matter. While not natural herd animals, even unbroken Uvak were strongly suggestible to the booming bleats of elder males, the exact sort the Neshtavar tended. Stories had been passed down of aerial roundups over the centuries, with riders leading clouds of the reptiles through the sky. Adari's would be a rolling storm front, sweeping up all of the animals in the countryside in vast, successive waves. They'd crafted their routes to funnel every Uvak that wasn't tied down toward the Cecil Spire, looming ahead in its smoldering majesty. Here, safely away from the crater, the lead riders would set their beasts down just long enough to dismount. Remaining aloft, Adari would order Nink to give a nesting cry, a powerful command compelling all Uvak within earshot to immediately follow. At 40, pampered Nink was the oldest Uvak in memory. All Uvak would blindly heed his command briefly, but long enough, Adari figured, for her to soar into the clouds high above the smoking crater and disappear. It wouldn't be suicide, it would be deliverance. The Sith had traveled far on Uvak back, but the Neshtavar were the recipients of generations of knowledge of the air currents of Kesh. They knew the odd things the jet stream did when the Cecil Spire acted up. Raiders flying high enough simply vanished, hurtling beyond the morning horizon, far over the great eastern sea. She would climb high, and the wind would claim her and any Uvak that followed. Despite her initial dislike of Uvak, she winced at the thought of what would follow. The frantic flock would struggle against the vortex, but at such an elevation, Kesh was in command. Perhaps a similar phenomena had disabled the Sith vessel. Adari didn't know, but by the time the winds weakened, she and every Uvak she could convince to follow would be headed for a watery end, just like my husband, she mused. Her co-conspirators loved their Uvak, but they hated the Sith more. They had often discussed what would happen next. The Sith leaders would descend on their service path, but it would take time during which Adari's allies and would strike at the major Sith sympathizers in each village. There would be no open resistance. It would be shikar blades in the night. The Sith might be proud. In truth, of course, the Sith would lash out. Tav would surely feel their wrath, but the Sith would be running their program on foot. Their transportation would be gone from the map, literally, and the Kashiri would find it easier to kill the remaining stray Uvak than Sith. The Sith now had young of their own to protect. They might simply stake out a chunk of territory for themselves and leave it at that. Or better still, they might retire to their mountain refuge for good. Most Kashiri still idolized their protectors, but as long as some of them were willing to poison their masters, they would forever be a danger. Presuming poison killed the Sith at all, Adari had never really shared her Confederates' enthusiasm about the aftermath. She knew what the Sith were capable of. It might take 1,000 Kashiri to kill a single one, but even if it did, right now the odds still favored the Kashiri. They wouldn't later on, which is why this has to be today, she thought. Kesh teemed with life. That one of its species would pay a price for its usefulness was tragic, but the Kashiri had already paid a price for their own usefulness to the Sith. Both had to end. Her group merging with the flyers from the east, Adari whipped Nink around and looked in the direction of Tav. That would be the big wave. When it arrived, where were they? Sela dashed across the rooftop of her old home. For half of her life she'd awakened to the same view of the sea that had swallowed Devor. Now, looking down, she saw her forces closing in on the human who'd sent him there. She hadn't seen how, but Corson and Gloyd had gotten separated. The lumbering Hook was still alive. She knew her loyal aides had chased him into another part of the complex, but Corson was the key. He'd chosen his bodyguards well. 2 remained alive, injured but effective in their misguided defense. Jared's team of Sabers, meanwhile, had proven lacking in formal training. He'd insisted on being their only mentor, but had only begun serious combat training in recent weeks, after Sela made the decision to strike. Jared reminded her more of his father every day. There was no corner Devor Corson would not cut. The Uvak disappearance was an unexpected problem, but it cut equally, removing escape for all. The Kashiri had cleared all the animals out. Had Jared made that preparation without telling her? Unlikely, but it seemed to have affected Corson's hopes. There, down on the reinforced slope beside Omen's temple, he continued to look up. Sela was certain he wasn't looking at her. She relished the view. Jared had Corson now. Trained or not, his sabers had the numbers. As her bodyguards lagged, Corson backed toward the precipice, the same mark from which Devor had fallen. Jared would like that. He seemed to be relishing every moment, slashing again and again at Corson, his blade occasionally finding its mark.
Lost your sound.
What? I lost. It shows I'm. Okay, I was just told that I lost sound. So, I don't know. I'll just pause here for a second. I'll be right back. That's weird because it showed.
Yeah,
I had the sound meter going.
It was there up until like 60 seconds ago. I can't.
Huh.
I just closed it down and restarted. I don't know what.
Okay. Well, there's no sound in this.
Oh.
Be right back because I still haven't gotten around to fixing it. Let me go back and see. Okay, testing, testing. Do we have any sound now? What in the heck? I don't know what's going on here. Because it shows my sound meters picking it up. The captions are picking it up. Hmm. 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 Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I think it's on your end. Be right back. I went into
It could be.
I went into my browser and unmuted the tab, and I had sound.
Yeah, I did lose it.
You have to do Windows and F12 to do it. Hmm.
What the hell, man?
Mm-hmm. Well, is it going through your speakers? Because the light's off on your speaker. Shouldn't that central light be on?
Oh, there it is. How in the hell did that happen?
I don't know. Okay. So the technical difficulty was not mine. All right, coming back to it. So where were we? I'll just start at the first of this page. The Kashiri had cleared all the animals out. Had Jerry had made that preparation without telling her? Unlikely, but it seemed to have affected Corson's hopes. There, down on the reinforced slope beside Omen's temple, he continued to look up. Seela was certain he wasn't looking at her. She relished the view. Jerry had Corson now. Trained or not, his sabers had the numbers. As his bodyguards lagged, Corson backed toward the precipice, the same mark from which Devore had fallen. Jared would like that. He seemed to be relishing every moment, slashing again and again at Corson, his blade occasionally finding its mark. Corson was hurt now, bleeding badly. Jerry had pushed ever closer, driving his uncle backward, and yet Corson kept looking up. What was he expecting? A crash from behind drew her attention. The limp form of one of her aides rocketed through the skylight and disappeared over the side. So that's where Gloyd is. He had to be contained, away from the action below. Angered at being robbed of seeing Corson die, she turned to the shattered skylight, only to lose her footing as beating wings soared across the crest of the rooftop. Sela rolled sideways, avoiding the kicking, clawed feet. The Uvak were back. Tumbling through the gaping hole, Sela hit the stone floor on all fours. Gloyd's battle was in the next room, but she scrambled for the window anyway. She had to see. Had the Kashiri returned with the Uvak, or was it someone she had never considered, never counted on? Looking out, she saw Nita. And that's the end of that chapter. Chapter 4. Corson had played his trump. Nita's very existence, he knew, was part of Sela's game to keep herself and Jared close to the seat of power. Sela had caringly found a series of Kashiri nursemaids and then tutors for the child, boarding her in one village after another. Officially, it was a gesture of Sith trust in the Kashiri. In truth, it reflected the hole he'd always known was in his wife's heart. There was more. Sela wasn't just getting Nita out of the way. Corson knew she was preventing her daughter from receiving anything more than superficial training in Sith ways. Sela kept the roles of Sith on Kesh. She knew where all potential mentors were at any time. But Corson had several loyal crew members willing to serve him in any role. With Gloyd's help, Corson had staged their deaths in remote areas of Kesh and sent them into hiding. All during the nights of Nita's seeming exile, the girl had secretly been learning the ways of the dark side, even as, during the days, she was winning Kashiri friends and building a network of informants. All in her seemingly meaningless but very mobile role as aerial ambassador for the Sith. While Sela was striving to portray herself as the model Sith on Kesh, Corson was crafting a leader, someone with the talents to fight and to govern, an heir, and today a savior. The night before, one of Nita's Kashiri acquaintances had revealed the plot to steal the Uvak while the principal Sith were atop the mountain. She'd spent the morning making sure whatever the Kashiri were doing went no further. Before joining Corson here, along with her Skyborn Rangers and several Corson partisans, not many, and not as soon as he'd hoped, but enough, and in time. He'd flushed out his enemies by coming here. Their surprise was complete. Nita leapt to the ground, lightsaber glowing, impaling one of Jared's thugs as she landed. Two converged upon her position, only to be cut in half. She threw a third into the temple wall just behind. There wasn't much fighting ground by the cliffside, but Nita was already dominating it. Jared himself had backed away before the kill, joining his sabers in their fight. A muffled explosion came from the mansion further up the hill. Gloyd, Corson knew, gritting his teeth. He dabbed at the gash on his chest. He wasn't coming back from this, he knew. The ground faltered beneath him. There wasn't much left. But he looked up again at Nita. So strong, his future for the Sith battling Sela's future and winning. Wincing in pain, Corson crawled back from the precipice toward the fray. Jared, injured and struggling to stall his siblings' advance, looked back in surprise. "You're right, Jared," Corson said, choking back blood. "It's time for me to go, but not without my last official act, and it's overdue." Adari should have been more surprised. By nightfall, more than 1,000 Kashiri had arrived near the foot of the spire, leading 5 times that many riderless Uvak. The mob of beasts circling high above the smoking formation had given the appearance of a living, leathery halo. It was stirring but disappointing. This many would barely have filled the Uvak pens in the southern foothills. Adari had given up scanning the horizon long before her compatriots did. At midnight, a lone rider from Tav had arrived, breathless and terrified. His report confirmed her suspicion. Tona had fallen under Nita Corson's spell and revealed all their plans. It had been hopeless from the beginning. Someone would have betrayed them. Tona was just the weakest. Adari had turned away before she heard whether Nita had rewarded Tona or killed him. Nothing mattered anymore. What had surprised Adari was what had happened next. She'd expected everyone to leave, to fly away, free their Uvok, and melt back into Kashiri society before the Sith found them. Instead, when she'd somberly taken to the clouds on Nink and headed for the dark river of air, she'd found the entire entourage in her wake. She'd fallen asleep, assuming Nink would surrender to gravity in the night. So many others had already fallen away. Her turn would come, but she awoke to something else. From above, the spit of land was no more than a seam between the waves, a chain of reefs adjoining a mucky surface barely larger than her old neighborhood. Nothing about it suggested a haven, but the jet stream had given out, and so had Nink. Of the riders who had begun, fewer than 300 remained. It was this or nothing. And this is close to nothing, she thought, as she padded across the salty grime of the beach. The mainland had provided everything the Kashiri needed to thrive. Here, bare necessities would have to be clawed for. Infrequent rains pooled fresh water on concave reefs. The Uvok, useless in their doldrums, would have to be culled dramatically to give the scant vegetation a chance. Their flesh was barely edible. Their carcasses yielded the only building materials. To her intellectual pursuits, the island offered nothing at all, just the same volcanic rubble from beach to hillcrest. Years in a purgatory of her own making weren't enough, it seemed. Now she must be bored to death. All she'd found was an ancient Kashiri corpse, another lonely victim of the oceanic air currents. Why couldn't the Sith have landed here? She knew the answer. The Sith had been trapped in such a place. To save herself from them and from the elders, she had set them loose. Corson had been right those years ago. We all do what we have to do. They were doing it now. Adari looked at Nink, dying of exhaustion, forked feet barely responding to the caresses of the surf. She couldn't simply bury him when the time came. He'd be needed, just like the rest. The Uvok were integral to their survival, but disposable when necessary. The Sith had looked upon the Kashiri in exactly the same way. Adari studied her people, toiling mutely on the island. They expected they wouldn't survive the year. Worse, anyone who came looking for them would not be a savior. Perhaps Corson's Sith worried about the same thing, she thought. Perhaps the tales were true. Perhaps the real Skyborn, the true protectors of legend, were out there somewhere hunting for the Sith. She didn't believe it. But then she never had. Sela awoke... switch to Sela. Sela awoke on a slab in her old sick ward. There wasn't any difference between the patient accommodations and the buyers in the morgue. It was all cold marble, just as everything in the accursed temple was. She was moving now, only her legs weren't. She remembered it all. Seconds after she saw Nita arrive, Gloyd brought the fight into her chamber. Gloyd had always bragged that whoever took him out wouldn't live to celebrate. Indeed, cornered by Sela and her confederates, Gloyd had activated something he must have had literally up his sleeve since the crash. A proton detonator. The Hook's insurance policy had brought the room down on the entire party. The Force had helped free Sela from the rubble that pinned her from the knees down, but nothing could make her walk again. She didn't need her medical training to recognize that. She'd worked tirelessly to become a perfect specimen of humanity, something for the tribe to aspire to. Now sitting up and surveying her cuts and bruises, she knew she would never live up to her old example again. "You're awake," came a soft female voice. "Good." Sela craned her neck to see her daughter in the doorway, wearing her outfit from dedication day. When Nita didn't move to enter, Sela used her aching arms to turn herself. You're going to be doing a lot of that, Nita said, stepping inside and dipping a cup into a basin. She drank deeply and exhaled. Oh, when you need it, the water's over here. She looked away. Nita explained how she had learned from Tonaval of the plan to steal the Sith's Uvok, timed just when as many important Sith as possible would be on the mountain. It had taken her more time than she expected, but she had foiled the plot in Tav and hurried to her father's side. I guess you can feel it. Father's gone. Sela licked her lips, tasting her own dried blood. Yes. And Jared? Father tried to throw him over the side with the Force, Nita said. He tried, and when he failed, I did it. Sela looked blankly at her daughter. I hated to use poor Tana like that, Nita said, but he thought he had something I wanted. She took another sip and dropped the cup. We had something in common, you know. Our mothers had no use for our fathers. Tana had revealed that the conspirators were taking the Uvok to the Cecil Spire, but he knew nothing beyond that. There's no sign of them there, Nita said. Our guess is they plunged themselves into the lava pit. In spite or fear, it doesn't matter. Sith or Kashiri, descent was finished on Kesh. It had been a productive day. I came here because we just had the reading of Father's final testament, she said. It existed in her care. He commends his legacy to me, and the 3 surviving High Lords have ratified it. So you see, you are the mother of the new Grand Lord. Congratulations. Nita beamed. At her age, she could expect to rule Kesh for decades to come. Or until the Sith come to rescue us. Sela sneered. You are a child. She slid from the slab only to brace herself against it with her hands, when her feet failed to respond. No one's coming for us. Your father knew that. He told me. It doesn't really matter to me, one way or the other. It should, Sela said, struggling to straighten. If I tell those people out there... Nita casually replaced the cup and stepped back toward the doorway. There's no one out there, she said. Perhaps you should hear the rest of Father's final wishes. Henceforth, she explained, on the death of the Grand Lord, that person's spouse and household laborers too would be sacrificed, technically to honor him. Or her, but you and I know what it's about. She ran her gloved fingers through her hair. I imagine it's going to put a crimp in my social life, but I'll cope. Sela caught her breath. You mean... Relax, Nita said. Henceforth. No, I've ordered that all Sith remove themselves from this mountain, in honor of Father's passing. While I live, none may return here. This is your new home. Again. And with that, she stepped out into the courtyard. It took Sela painful minutes to follow, dragging herself across the stonework. Nita was stepping onto the stirrup of her Uvok, surrounded by Hijarbo shoot crates of fruit and vegetables. More would be dropped by regular Uvok overflights, Nita said, the only creatures, wild or trained, to be allowed in the airspace above the temple. Elsewhere in the compound, access to Omen's shelter had been cut off. Below, the path up the mountain had been barricaded, was being barricaded even now. It had been painstakingly carved, but it would now be blocked forever. What remained, Sela saw as she looked around, was the cold temple she had come to despise living in. A home fit only for a goddess on high, forever alone. Nita, Sela coughed as Nita began to take flight. Nita, you're my child. Yes, that's what they tell me. Goodbye. And that is it. That's the end of the book. It is left off there. All right. Well, as I said earlier, the next thing in line, let me double check here. The next thing in line is the Ulik Keldroma comic series then the Saga of Nomi Sunrider, the Friedenad Uprising, all comics, and then we finally get back to. Oh no, wait. What's in between there? Something missing here. Oh, then we get into some of the Tales of the Jedi, Redemption. Wow, whole bunches. Comics. We're going to be doing comics for a long time here. Knights of the Old Republic. Like a bunch of them. And then finally, we get back to Lost Tribe of the Sith, Purgatory. So yeah, we may have to go back and review. We may have to go back and review this one just to remember where we were in the story by the time we get back to it, because I only do one comic per reading. Since they only take 20 minutes usually, I may just go ahead and do 2 because we do have so many to get through. But yeah, that's the plan for the next couple of months, it looks like. And then we've got books 5 and 6, and then we get on into more comics and some more books, and there's so much to read in this timeline. So anyway, that'll be it for this session. It's early enough. I'm going to come back and play a little bit of Hogwarts Legacy. So I will see you all in just a little bit after a break.
Your planet is now under stranger's control. Humanity